right, good afternoon, everyone. It is 1:32, so let's go ahead and get started. We are really excited to have y'all here for today's webinar. My name is Becky Park, and I am the Executive Director for the Conference on Crimes Against Women, of which the Institute for Coordinated Community Response is a program of. So thank you again for joining us this morning. We have a full house. So super excited about that. Let's get started with a few housekeeping items. We encourage you to use the chat box at this time to ask any questions you should have for Suzanne. She has left time at the end of her amazing presentation to answer any questions. So just keep those in the chat, and along with your introductions, that would be really great. A little background on the Institute for Coordinated Community Response. We were created in 2018. As I said, as a program of the Conference on Crimes Against Women. ICCR is a training and technical assistance program whose mission is to work alongside rural communities to improve their collaborative systemic responses to domestic violence. ICCR hosts monthly webinar trainings geared towards the needs of rural practitioners. And in all of our trainings, we work to center the unique needs and strengths of rural communities while providing practical skills and tools that can be immediately implemented. You can learn more about ICCR on our website, www.instituteccr.org. And I encourage you to sign up for our e-blasts that will help you all stay up to date and in the loop on all of these great trainings that we do provide throughout the year. And speaking of great trainings, we are so happy to welcome Suzanne Holsomback. And she'll do her great introduction, but we're excited for supporting rural survivors by working with local faith communities. So that's where we're at, and we're ready to get started. So Suzanne, thank you for being here. I'll stop sharing and you can take it away.
Wonderful. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today. And I wanted to thank the Institute for Coordinated Community Response for inviting me to join you all today. I am honored to be with you all. I see a number of names that are familiar and some friendly faces and some friends. And so I'm excited to be here with you all. Let me share my screen with you all. Can you all see my PowerPoint okay? All right, it's not covered up by my Zoom stuff. Okay, perfect. I've got a lot of things happening on my screen. Well, today we are talking about supporting rural survivors of abuse and violence and harm by working with local faith communities and engaging with local faith communities. What we're actually going to be covering today is we're going to go through barriers that rural survivors experience when they're accessing services or trying to get to safety. We're going to also distinguish how engaging with faith communities can support folks in overcoming those barriers and reducing some of those barriers. We're going to define how this ultimately does support survivors, and then provide a few frameworks for how to engage with faith communities. So some folks don't really always know where to start with engaging with faith communities. Some people have wonderful relationships. Some people, it's a mixed bag. So we'll discuss that very briefly, but we will touch on that just a little bit. A little bit about me. My name is Suzanne Holsomback. My pronouns are she, hers, hers. I am based in Austin, Texas in the United States. Thank you all for introducing yourselves in the chat. I see we've got folks from all over, which is wonderful. I actually started working in the DVSA movement in the United Kingdom. Do I have anyone hanging out with us from the United Kingdom? Anyone? maybe not. But I started working in prevention. I did prevention work at universities, and I did hotline advocacy work while I was there. When I moved back to Texas, I started volunteering and then working in the domestic and sexual violence movement here in Texas. And so I've had a really unique experience of working in another country in this movement and then working in Texas. I worked in local programs, and the program that I was part of was in a suburb of Austin, Texas, which, if you know anything about Austin, Austin is growing exponentially. It's one of the fastest growing areas in the United States. And the county that we were based in had suburb, and then it also had rural areas. And so part of my job was to work and engage with those rural areas, which is where I started really developing this interest in engaging with faith communities. And a lot of that came because I myself used to work in faith communities. So my bachelor's degree is in religion and classics. I have a Master of Divinity, and then I also have another master's degree in anthropology. And so I am an ordained minister, and I used to work in faith communities for many years. And I think at this point in my life, and by the amount of white in my hair, you can tell I've had several different career paths. And so I've had over 10 years working in faith communities and religious organizations. And then I've been in the DVSA movement for over 10 years now. So it's been a wonderful journey. And this type of engagement, these type of discussions allow me to fuse those two things together. And I really do enjoy that. I do have a cat. You might see her jump up on my desk. I am in my home, and so if you do, please pardon that. And I do like to garden as well. So just a little fun bit about me. I am the founder of a consultancy called Santolina Consulting, and one of my programs out of that consultancy is called Violence Free Faith. And this program really birthed out of conversations and trainings that I was doing as part of my consultancy, specifically around engaging social services and how to reach out to faith communities and strengthen those relationships, but also how faith communities could become safer places for survivors of abuse and violence. And so Violence Free Faith was kind of the culmination of that, and it is still growing and developing, and I'm excited to see where it goes in the next few years. So to kind of get us started, I wanted to share a little bit of language. So we are on kind of the same page, and we're working off of the same definitions for our session today. And if you all do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I've got it up so I can see it pretty well. And the definitions that we're working off of are not, they don't cover absolutely everything, so they're not exhaustive, but they will be what we start with. So the first thing is, what is a faith community? I actually have a whole training on what is a faith community and defining that and creating a more expansive understanding of what a faith community is and then how to engage with them. But for the purposes of this webinar, we are going to stay a little bit more focused, and it's going to be a bit more of a brick and mortar type of faith community. So we're going to say churches, kingdom halls, mosques, Islamic centers, temple, synagogue, religious centers, parachurch organizations, or parasynagogue, paratemple. What that means is that it is alongside of. So it is potentially a nonprofit or a social service that works very closely with or alongside of a faith community. This could also potentially be religious education institutes of varying kinds, retreat centers, shrines, those types of things. And I wanted to kind of keep a more narrow definition of faith communities for the purposes of this training, because in many rural areas, when folks are talking about a faith community, they're really going to think of the place, whether that is an actual like physical brick and mortar building, if it is a rented space, and if it's in a strip shopping mall, or if it's in a gym of a school, or anything like that. So it could potentially be many different things, but a lot of times it's going to be like a physical place where people are gathering. The next definition is survivor. When we talk about survivor, it's gonna be a person who has experienced any type or any form of violence and abuse. So this is going to include child abuse, adults who have experienced abuse as a child, elder abuse. I will use victim and survivor interchangeably because I can imagine there's probably a good group of folks in here that might be coming from a law enforcement position or role, or they're coming from a background of law enforcement. And so I'll use those terms interchangeably. When I talk about violence and abuse, that is going to be all forms of harm. So physical, sexual, verbal, psychological, emotional, digital. It's going to include stalking. It's going to include religious abuse. And so all of that is, excuse me, oriented to be able to control another person, to exert power over them, to control another person. So when I talk about harm, we're kind of talking about all of those different things, those tactics that are being utilized to control another person. And this is probably the definition that is going to be the most meaningful for us here is rural. What does rural mean? So I'm in Texas, and so a number of my examples are going to be from Texas because I've worked here in Texas and I live here in Texas. If you are in another state and you're all like, this is really cool, I wonder what it's like in my state, please feel free to reach out to me. We can figure this out. We can do some digging and find it out. For Texas, and I imagine probably a number of other states, rural is defined, or like a rural community is defined as a population with less than 25,000 people. In my head, I was like, oh, that's a lot of people. But, that's going to be rural. And a rural county is going to be under 50,000. So that gives you kind of an idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about rural. I know most people think of it's probably much smaller than that. When I was doing some research for this, the numbers can go quite high for what a rural county might be, but the general kind of standard is about 50,000. And so what is interesting is like rural has like a number value attached to it, but it also most definitely has a cultural value, or like a cultural nuance to it. When folks talk about rural, there's normally something that comes to mind. And government definitions are also functioning off of that as well. So they're normally talking about resources, infrastructure, things like that will lead to this definition of rural. And rural can be lots of things. Rural can be farmland, rural can be forest, rural can be more desert-like, rural can be, mining. Rural can be a lot of different things depending on where you are. So for Texas, and I show you this map, not because I'm assuming everyone is from Texas, but I find this very, very interesting for a map for Texas. So for some of you all who are in smaller states, your rural might be closer to larger cities. Texas has rural communities that are in the middle of nowhere. And so you can see these little dots all across this map are quote unquote rural communities. But what's really interesting about this map is that there are some of these little dots that are around very large cities. So this is Dallas up here. And this is Harris County. This is the size of Connecticut. This is where Houston is. But look at these little pockets of actual communities that are considered rural. I find this fascinating. I actually lived in one of these when I first moved back to the United States. It was a little bitty town of 200 people, overshadowed by the Houston Ship Channel. And I think it is actually this little dot right here. But what's interesting is that rural is much closer to us than a lot of folks think. A lot of people think rural is really far away. They might not ever engage with it. If you're an advocate or if you're working in a larger urban center, you might be like, rural's not that far away. Rural is actually pretty close to a lot of us. And so that's why I like kind of getting a definition kind of out there, but also using maps like this to be like, oh, wow, there's actually a lot of rural communities quite close to us. And then you can see if we actually go by the definition of a rural county, there's a bunch of them out there. And especially in Texas. And you can kind of see where some of the main highways are and where the big cities are. But in very close proximity for like right here where I live in Travis County, right next to us in adjoining counties would be considered rural. And so folks from rural counties are coming and looking into the urban center for resources and things like that. So we've got those definitions. Is everyone pretty good with those? We're tracking with those? Okay. And so when we're starting to think about like rural survivors, there are certain barriers for rural survivors that are going to be similar to survivors in any area. There's a lot of barriers that are very similar or identical, but rural survivors have some additional barriers that are also there. So I want to quickly go over those, and I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time on these because I want to be mindful of getting to kind of some other pieces. So one of the biggest things is a barrier is lack of resources. So with social services, in some social services, folks will call these service deserts. In Texas, they're actual real deserts too, but and I saw someone from the Nevada Coalition, you got real deserts out there too. And a great example of this is I was supporting a survivor once, and she was in a county that adjoined a county of a mega city. But her county had no services, no DV program, very few, if any, social services. There were a couple church ministries, but there was like nothing out there. And what was interesting is everyone just kind of assumed, oh, you would come into the county with the big city. But because her address was in that other county, so many services in the big county would not support her because she was not in county, she was not in region. And so social services do have some kind of areas of gaps, or they're just not able to because of funding. They might have a funding source that's like, you can only support folks in this county. There's also the reality that a lot of DV and SA programs are based in urban centers, and then they'll have satellite sites in potentially other counties, but that might not be fully staffed. There might only be an advocate there a couple days a week. The actual shelter might be in the larger urban area. And so there's, a proximity, there's a distance that's harder to get to. And so there just might not be access to services in that area. There's also the lack of healthcare. Doctors, hospitals, emergency rooms, things like that. So if there are sexual assaults and domestic violence incidents that are requiring healthcare, there might be less opportunities to get to healthcare, but that also reduces the opportunities for interventions, because healthcare providers have a huge opportunity to intervene. And you've seen an uptick in training like labor and delivery nurses on spotting domestic violence and other medical personnel as well, because a lot of times they're the ones that can intervene and ask, because they have moments of privacy and confidentiality with the patient that a lot of other folks don't have. In rural areas, even getting an ambulance out to you might take a really long time. I'm going to reference my family is from an area of East Texas. It's incredibly rural. It's a little town of 1,100 people. And to get an ambulance out to that, it would take 30 minutes, just one way for an ambulance to get to you, if they're not somewhere else in the county. If you wanted to drive to the hospital and you're actually driving the speed limit, which no one does, it would probably take you about 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So healthcare is going to be really spread out as well. There's a cultural thing about healthcare as well. We'll talk about that in a moment. There's also lack of housing in rural areas, housing that is affordable, housing that can someone can get on a lower income. That's going to be reduced. Apartment blocks, things like that just aren't going to be as readily available. We also have the issue of legal services. There are fewer legal services. There are fewer lawyers. There's just fewer folks to reach out to and talk to about legal things. There's also less childcare. formal or informal. A lot of folks will probably use more informal childcare in rural areas. A friend or a family member might look after kids, but there's less of it. And if your children are being utilized as part of the abuse and they're kind of being used as an abuser is threatening them or actually actively harming them, then leaving them with family members poses a risk. And so having childcare that can be secure or even available or affordable is very low. Technology is also a big one, and I think this is a growing one as well. A lot of rural areas do not have the infrastructure for technology. I don't know if any of you all have had to use satellite internet. It is trash. It's terrible. And like you gotta like go and like spray some like Rain-X on your dish and clean it off and just hope it's not cloudy. It's just it's terrible. And I was like, well, no wonder like people can't get internet out here. And that goes with lots of other technologies. You might not have proper cell service. You might not have some of those accessible things that we are very comfortable with in a more suburban or urban area. I've heard that in some places, Google Fiber is actually coming to some rural areas, which is fascinating because Google Fiber is getting there faster than other forms of infrastructure like internet and other like, you know, kind of like wireless internet and satellite, things like that. So I find that really interesting, but we'll see how that goes. There are other barriers around isolation for rural survivors that it is probably one of the most pronounced parts of barriers for rural survivors is the isolation, just both physical and social. And so when we are thinking about just kind of the space between folks, that is one aspect of it. Things are farther apart. People drive longer distances to get to grocery stores, to go to church, to go to their faith communities, to see their family. That long distance is much more normalized. But that distance also creates isolation. So when I was doing some research for this, there was one researcher who said, when your neighbors are 15 miles away, no one can hear you scream. And I just sat with that for a moment and I was like, that's really intense because I can like see in my neighbor's bathroom, which is super weird. Trust me. I was like, I live very close to people. And I was like, but it's true. There are also some rural areas that have homes that are closer together. And so there's more of that. But folks that live on farms and ranches and out in the country, that physical distance is going to create some barriers for that. There might also be barriers just about road access. Poor roads, dirt roads, roads that are closed off by ice and snow for part of the year. Or if it's flooding, the road is flooded out, or the road is underwater if it has like a low water access to it. You know, some folks might not be able to leave the property, or they're so far out, they don't have transportation, they don't have a car or a truck. How do they get off the property? And so that social isolation starts to kick in. If someone doesn't have a way to get into town or to get into a city, don't necessarily have ways to see people, then those forms of communication really start to become a barrier and they get isolated. Perpetrators of harm can use that social distance, can use the lack of technology to further isolate rural survivors. And so really creating a bubble where they don't have a lot of support and don't feel like they can get support because they do feel very, very alone. Another barrier can be transportation, and this is a huge one, and a lot of folks are going to see this kind of in lots of different areas is barriers with transportation. So, you know, access to a vehicle, they might only have one. The distance between places is going to be much larger, especially in states that have larger geographic areas or just lower population centers like Montana or Wyoming. Those types of folks are going to have to drive much further to get to services or to get to a city that has services. Just the access is going to be hard. Do you have access to a vehicle? does the perpetrator of harm have the only keys? Do they take the keys with them? Or do they potentially take the car, take the truck, and then leave the person at home? What's the access to the vehicle or to transportation? Most rural areas do not have public transportation. They don't have buses. Some might have some rideshare type of situations going on, but some of them don't. This is a little bit of hit and miss. I would be really curious to know from you all, if you are located in a rural area, is there like Uber and Lyft? Or are there taxis? I feel like I've heard some folks be all like, yeah, we got like some Uber. We got someone that will Uber you around. It might be one person, but other folks are like, nope, there's nothing out here. A couple years ago, I was in Tyler, Texas. I saw someone come in here from Tyler. Tyler's a pretty sizable town. And I couldn't find an Uber. And I was like, I don't know what's happening here. I don't know. Maybe I'm just like, it was too old. I'm not sure. But oh yeah, someone from Nevada says Nevada rurals don't have Uber, Lyft, or taxis or anything like that. So we're going to run into that where public transportation or transportation is just non-existent. The other thing about ride shares is, what do you need to actually book a ride share? You need a phone so you can have the app. You need the internet. You need a credit card. And all of those things are potentially things you might not have. Yeah, you need tech. You need tech to do all of that. So, oh yeah, Laura Beth is saying that it's cost prohibitive. 100%, yeah. Is that's going to, along with the tech, the cost is going to be there. The other transportation barrier is gas. That kind of goes into that cost prohibitive. Gasoline is expensive. If it's just normal gas, if it's diesel gas, it's going to be expensive. And if you have a really controlling person causing harm, they might be watching the levels of gas. They know how much gas it takes to get into town and back, and they're going to be really suspicious and ask a lot of questions on why more gas was used, or why more money was spent on gas if a survivor had to go into a larger town and back. And so being really suspicious of that and controlling that. There's also barriers just around awareness of what domestic and sexual violence are. And so there's the reality that different people need different types of education and different types of awareness around domestic and sexual violence. And so a lot of times the survivors themselves might not identify with some more stereotypical definitions of domestic violence. So if you've heard me, I've used the term harm quite a bit. I've noticed that up in like Washington State and Oregon and that area, they've really started to emphasize using the term harm, because a lot of folks and a lot more survivors can relate to that. Someone has harmed them, someone's causing harm, because a lot of times folks they're not there. They can't quite identify this as abuse or violence yet. It might be violence. They might not be able to actually like say this is abuse. And that's part of a journey and part of understanding. And so that awareness of the survivor of, what are they actually experiencing? If their religious beliefs and cultural beliefs and their community all are all like, this is completely normal. This is what happens in a marriage. This is boys being boys. And there's that kind of cultural element to it, then that minimization of what is happening and that harm is part of the awareness that needs to happen. And that can be potentially a barrier. And education and awareness can help kind of buttress some of that. There's also the awareness of law enforcement as well. Do they know what domestic violence is? Like legally, and like state laws and like state codes have a definition of domestic violence, sexual violence, family, stalking, those types of things. Hawaii even has coercive control in their state laws now. And so is law enforcement aware of what those are? But then again, are they aware of the more expansive understanding and definition of that? And so that's something to be aware of. Like, does law enforcement need the education and the support around that? Some states do have laws in place that are requiring law enforcement to be educated on the dynamics of domestic violence and kind of the kind of breadth of it, but a lot aren't, or they're choosing not to learn about it. faith leaders they're going to have probably very low awareness of what domestic violence is. I was in a training a couple years ago, and there was a faith leader, and he'd been a minister for, I believe, 40 years. And he sat back and he was like, in my 40 years, I've only seen 2 cases of domestic violence. Everyone else in that small group gave him side eye like nobody's business. We were all like, no, sir, that's just statistically not possible. But when we sat and we kind of listened a little bit more, what he was talking about was physical violence. And he had only seen 2 cases of physical violence in his faith community. And that too is statistically improbable. But it got me really thinking, is that he had a very, very narrow definition of what domestic violence was. But also, as a man in a position of power, I bet if you had asked his wife, she would have had a very different answer. And so a lot of times faith leaders are folks that need awareness, that they have gained their definition from the wider community, from entertainment and other things like that. And because most faith leaders do not learn about this in seminary or like a faith training institute. It's very low. The ones that do might get it in like a counseling course, but a lot of folks who are actually trained to be like pastors or the lead ministers do not get training on that in any way, shape, or form. And that is an area that I think DV programs and SA programs can work a lot. Like if you've got a faith training institute or like, you know, educational institute in your community, have a relationship with them, get to know them, because they're prepping the faith leaders of the future. So Shannon shared in the comments, low awareness and often extreme denial on the faith leaders' part, not in the church. Yes, I'm going to talk about beliefs in just a moment. But yeah, faith leaders might just not be really aware of kind of the general like expanse of it. And a lot of faith leaders, you can connect with them because a lot of them might be doing premarital counseling or premarital support of a couple. And that gives a really great opportunity to talk about domestic and sexual violence in the case of that. But it's unlikely that faith leaders have gotten any type of formal education while they were becoming faith leaders. Community leaders are going to be the same. They might not know, they might know some, just because they might be a little bit more aware of law enforcement reports and things like that. They might just kind of have a broader view of the community, but that doesn't happen here. Syndrome might be really high, where they're all like, we're safe, we're a wonderful community, everyone knows each other. That doesn't happen here. So the awareness around community leaders also needs to happen because they're the ones who can make decisions. They're some of the gatekeepers for those communities. And then just the wider community in and of itself. So many folks will talk to family, talk to friends, talk to their hairstylist, talk to lots of folks in kind of hopes of getting validation and getting support. And so making sure that there's a conversation that people kind of understand what this is and what's happening to folks, and then that they're able to support and get people to help. And then just the awareness of minimization and denial. Communities can minimize and deny what's happening. And I kind of mentioned this earlier, where they're just all like, oh, that everyone's like that. You know, men are just more, you know, more kind of, you know, masculine here. They're a little bit more gruffer because we're in a rural area. You know, they have to be. It's kind of, you know, the survival instinct. You know, I've even heard someone be like, oh, you're not the top of the food chain out here. So there's kind of this like almost like badge of honor and having kind of a more violent element to you and your personality. And so when that is interpersonal, there's minimization of it and denial of it. It's not that bad. Everyone experiences that, those types of minimization and denial. So the cultural thing, I've touched on this a little bit. This is fascinating. So I love culture. I love talking about culture. I love studying about culture. I find culture fascinating. And the barriers around rural culture are very, very nuanced because rural culture is not homogenous. It is not one culture. There's lots of expressions of it. But one of the biggest things is gender norms. So in many rural areas, gender norms, gender stereotypes are going to be pronounced, but sometimes it's in really interesting ways. And so you might have like the kind of, masculinity that is set up as like the cowboy, the rugged individual, that's one with nature or is in nature, is like part of, or it's like this kind of struggle between like man and in nature. Where women are kind of stereotyped as like the keepers of the home and the domestic. I don't know about you all, but the rural women I know are some tough cookies. And they are not to be crossed either. And so they can use firearms like anyone else. And so the gender norms sometimes are really unique and a little kind of, they break stereotypes, but the community also reasserts and validates norms and reinforces them in really unique ways. And so there's a whole conversation in there, and I won't go too deep into it, but there's that kind of bucking of gender norms, but also reinforcing of them as well. So there's a really unique kind of balance in there. There is a cultural element in a lot of rural communities of coupling as partners, having a partner, dating, getting married, and being a unit. And some folks might think that's actually kind of historic from, you need people to survive. You have to like create your own little unit to be able to survive the wilds. But I think that's also something where religious beliefs have really infused a lot of rural areas around this idea of partnering and getting married and having a family of one's own. And so that idea of coupling, so someone being on their own, being divorced or being single, it is not seen as normal, or that's just kind of, part of it. It's always seen with a little bit of suspicion. Not always, but sometimes. I talked a little bit about this with masculinity and femininity stereotypes. One of the best examples that I've seen recently, has anyone seen Yellowstone, the TV show? Couple people nodding, got some heads up. Okay, so I couldn't get through all of it because it was a little much. And sometimes you just have to take a break because you watch the news, it's a lot. I can't watch it all on entertainment as well. But what I found really interesting is that there's so many different archetypes of masculinity from the men and the women in Yellowstone. And I started thinking about that, and I was like, how fascinating. We have like kind of the old school cowboy who's trying to have his feels, he's trying to feel his feels, but struggling with that. We've got like well-educated, but still rugged. We've got the cowboy, like there's all these different masculinities, but also femininities as well with the different women that we're seeing. And I think that is so helpful because that is, in some ways, that fiction is telling us something about our real lives, is that there's not one type of masculinity or one type of femininity. And even that kind of polarization and that kind of, discussion of it doesn't really make sense because there's lots of expressions and people are expressing those by how they're interacting and how they're living out their gender and their identity of that. And so those are shifting constantly, and in different parts of the country, you'll see that. I think one of the interesting differences is between like Texas and Wyoming. I did a conference in Wyoming last year, and when I was talking to folks up there, just their kind of rural rugged was just, it was just different than what Texas rural rugged was. And I just found that so fascinating. And there was an element of politics, and there was an element of the religious communities that were most prevalent in Wyoming compared to Texas, but also just how it was colonized how it was settled when it became a state, and those type of historical features and facts. And so the culture was still, you know, vast areas of rural, but it was just slightly different. And so it's a really interesting kind of examination of that. Okay, the last barrier with culture is the shame, blame, and guilt that gets put out there. A lot of cultures will reinforce that and establish that and really kind of put that on folks about this is shameful. We don't talk about this. That's a family matter. We don't talk about that outside the home or outside the family. You know, it's your fault, and put a lot of guilt on people for that. There's also perceptions, and perceptions of urban programs, of urban DV programs. And so these are perceived cultural differences. Some of them might be real, but some of them are, a lot of them are perceived. I've heard people kind of talk about like, well, I don't know how things are done where you're from. And that being said, to me, as someone who lives in an urban center, and so there's this kind of all like, oh, you're different than us. And so that understanding, and urban programs are just, there's this perception of, well, they just don't get us. They're not like us. They do things differently than us. The perception of DV programs, and a lot of you all might experience this just in if you're working in an urban or suburb area, is DV programs have a perception that they split up families. And I do not know a single DV person who has not had to like explain that or talk that through and overcome that barrier with individuals or with their families. And I think there's also this kind of element of, if DV programs are in the urban centers, then there's also this kind of perception of them being liberal. When I started working in this field, one of my uncles who lives in a rural area, he'd be like, oh, you're working with all those women libbers. And I was all like, okay. And he was trying to insult me, but I was like, oh, you haven't insulted me yet. You're just complimenting me at this point. But it's that thing about like, you know, you're liberal, you're out there, you're doing this, you're doing that. So it's this perception. And that might not always be true. And so keeping that in mind, that perception. There's also a perception of rural safety. Like, we are safer in rural areas. The urban centers are dangerous. They have lots of crime. Statistically speaking, rural areas actually have a lot of crime. And there's actually quite a high homicide rate for population in rural areas. And so this idea that you are safer in a rural area is a mirage. And that is almost completely impossible to break down, because people are like, well, I know my neighbors. I've known them my whole life, or my whole family lives on this street. I know who's here. My kids are safe. So statistically, we know that most perpetrators of harm are known by their victims. And so are you safe? Well, that's kind of an awful way to live and to kind of, you know, engage with the world. But it is one of those things that the perception of safety in a rural area is much higher than an urban area. And so that can be a barrier where people are like, we're safe here. Why do we need prevention programming? It's safe here. We all know each other. We all look after each other. So there's also a barrier around relation proximity. So a survivor and their relationship to folks in the legal system, courts, the city, in law enforcement, in community leaders. If you are a rural survivor and, you know, your husband is in law enforcement, that's going to make it really, really hard to get support from law enforcement. Or, you know, your cousin is in the city council, or your abuser's brother is in law enforcement or is in healthcare, then that proximity is going to be a barrier on asking for help, trying to find help, or feeling like you can get help. Because if you go to law enforcement and your abuser's brother is the intake officer for you, and like that's a conflict of interest and all sorts of other things. But if that's the first person you see when you walk into a police station, how much less likely are you going to be to make a report or go through with any of that process? So there's that proximity to, that everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows everyone. That can be a great thing. It can also be a barrier. Shannon mentioned in the comments about religious beliefs, and this can be a barrier. I'm a firm believer that faith communities can be places of intense healing for folks. They can be intense places of harm as well. A lot of folks really want to focus on the harm. I personally have experienced religious abuse from a religious organization, and the place that provided me the most healing was my faith community that I was part of. So I got like a both and type of situation happening with religious organizations. And a lot of folks of faith will experience that as well. They have both seen harm and healing from faith communities, different faith communities or religious organizations. So religious beliefs, how that can be a barrier, authoritative text. So the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, other texts that are considered authoritative for that religious, and the interpretation that goes along with it. Someone who's like, well, this is what it says, and this is what it means, and that's the end of it. So that interpretation of that. The traditions that go along with those religious and those communities, some of the traditions are harmful. The traditional wording in some of the marriage ceremonies, the traditions around, becoming a woman, or the traditions around just, having children, being a dad, being a mom, things like that. The traditions that they have and the understandings that they have that are coming from that faith community. There's also this barrier with religious communities around the us, them, and religious communities creating kind of a barrier about like, we have the correct knowledge, and you don't, or that kind of, we're safe, we're Christians, or we're people of faith, we're people of the book, we're good, we're safe. And that us, them, like, you're not safe, but we are. And so that being a barrier to being able to access support in a faith community, or even have them be a support system for the wider community. So there are also racial and ethnic barriers. I know I've talked a lot about these, and I'm pushing time a little bit, so I'm going to go quickly through the rest of these. So there are lots of stereotypes that are barriers. There are barriers with law enforcement likely being white, and a perception of people of color being more violent, or that stereotype of experiencing harm more, or things like that. The reality that a lot of people of color do not feel safe with white police officers. There's also the barrier of jurisdictional issues. You can see this very clearly if you are in an area where there are tribes and sovereign nations. If there's domestic violence, there is tribal code on domestic violence, where the violence happens or what kind of violence it is. Is that tribal police? Is it like federal police? Like, what happens if it happens off reservation, or the family doesn't live on the reservation? Like, how does that tribal code work? Where does the jurisdiction lie? You can also see this on, there's a number of folks from different states in here. If you have a city that straddles two states, where's the jurisdiction? I supported a survivor once, and she had a restraining order, and she lived on a town that straddled Texas and another of the neighboring states. And her perpetrator of harm would break the restraining order, terrify her, like shoot guns around her house, and then cross the state line. So by the time the police got there, he was in another state. And so then they would have to contact that state's law enforcement. So by the time all the communication happened, he was long gone. And he just did this over and over and over and over. So the jurisdictional issues can be really, really difficult, and they're compounded with race and ethnic groups. Language access. If folks do not speak language, English as their first language, or if they are in trauma and they feel more comfortable speaking their first language, do they have access? If a police officer is taking a statement from them, do they have access to an interpreter? Do they have access to support materials and resources in a language that they feel most comfortable reading and speaking in? And then there is the reality that people of colors and communities of colors do have higher rates of violence and abuse. And there's so many reasons for that, and we could talk about that for a whole hour. But knowing that that is a barrier as well for accessing help, to trusting systems that can help, and also the services that are being provided, are they focusing on the communities that do need help? So there are some other big like barriers. Animals in rural areas, this is going to be a big one. If someone has livestock, shelters can't take a herd of cattle. But also large livestock are your income. They're also expensive. And you know, if an abuser is threatening to kill your animals, your large livestock, which, you know, could be tens of thousands of dollars if you have a show horse, you know, that threat is very real and it's very scary. There's also barriers around time. I mentioned this earlier, kind of around gas and someone watching gas. Like if you have to go into the nearest big city to go to a DV program, that's an hour-and-a-half drive. You spend an hour there in an intake or a meeting with your advocate, and you have to drive an hour-and-a-half back. That is 4 hours you have been gone. So that time can become a barrier. Do you have that much time to give, or is that time going to become suspicious? Firearms, access to firearms, the readily availability of firearms, just the kind of cultural presence of them in the community is normally higher, and the threat of them is much higher. And then drugs and alcohol. In so many parts of the country, the rural areas are being hit the hardest with methamphetamine and opioid addictions. That it's not a joke, like it's real serious, and it's very scary. And, you know, that's also an issue that is kind of mixed into this. And then the last barrier are economics. And I think as advocates, everyone will say economic barriers are normally some of the biggest ones to overcome. But in rural areas, the rates of poverty are higher. Access to finances are less. Like, can you get to a bank? Do you have access to the checking account? Do you have access to the bank account? A lot of local smaller banks are closing. Larger national banks are closing their smaller offices. So do you have access to that? Some folks don't have credit cards. They still are using cash. And it's a cash economy. Do they have access to cash? Job opportunities are fewer and far between. There's a pronounced wage gap between men and women in a rural area. That is across the entire nation, but the rural area, that gap is even larger. There's also it's harder to start fresh in a rural area, kind of with a lot of those other barriers. Everyone knows everyone. Well, if everyone knows everyone, it's hard to start fresh because everyone remembers what you did when you were 13. Or trying to start again, it's just really hard. Trying to, you know, find resources and start fresh. There might not be those opportunities, or people might not give you the opportunity to start fresh. And then again, kind of as we talked about before, there's very limited housing. So I've seen people putting things in the chat, so thank you so much for that. We can kind of come back to those, but I want to keep moving because we are tight on time. So in overcoming these barriers, what are we really, you know, talking about and thinking about with how we do this? And so there's 3 ways to really overcome all of these barriers that I have just spent a long time talking about. And so the first one's education and local action. So getting folks involved, creating that local action, and then coordination. And I saw when some of you were introducing yourself, some of you are already part of CCRs, which is wonderful. So we'll touch on that really briefly. So with these kind of three main ways to overcome barriers, how do we utilize those three kind of methodologies with faith communities specifically? Because that's why we're here. We want to know how do we work with these faith communities that we're part of, or that we know of, or that we work alongside of. How do we do that? So with education, we need to really create a cohesive and expansive definition for DV and SA for faith leaders. So I read this really wonderful article, and it was talking about it was in a rural town in Australia, and they had kind of sussed out and found out one of the nubs of their issues around service provision for domestic violence survivors is that social service providers had different definitions of DV. No one was talking about the same thing. And so they're just kind of like missing each other in the night. And so one of the biggest things you can do is get everyone on the same page. It does not have to be the same sentence. Just get everyone kind of in the similar page. And that is where those DV 101s, those foundational course, let's do like a myth busting. I love a good myths, facts, and stats type of session, because we can get really into those discussions. But provide some definitions that give people like a concrete, like, oh, this is what abuse is. And it is this and this and this. So creating that. Raise awareness of the scope and violence, that it doesn't happen here. It can be real strong in faith communities. And so statistically, a faith community is going to be like the general population, if not higher. And so raising awareness that the stats aren't like, you're not the exception. And that sounds a little harsh. And I probably would not start with that if I was talking with a faith community or faith leader, but letting them know that there are survivors of abuse and violence in your community. I read a story recently where a faith leader in Connecticut said that they started preaching about domestic violence from their pulpit. And on average, every time they talk about it, they have 4 people come forward and disclose that they are survivors of abuse. And I was like, wow, like that type of information, those types of stories. And I know lots of faith leaders who will confirm that. When they talk about it, people are like, that's me. I've experienced that, or I have experienced something like that. And so that's really powerful in raising awareness and letting folks know that it is happening in their communities. Provide continuing education opportunities for folks. There are some Christian denominations at some of the, I don't want to say older, that's not quite right, but some of the kind of more mainstream Protestant denominations that actually require their faith leaders to do education and continuing education on domestic violence. These are fabulous if you're looking for kind of like how to do that or what they're doing. You can always email me. I can share some of that information with you. But provide continuing education. Someone might have done like a foundational DV 101, but do a little bit more. Do a little bit more advanced, like mandatory reporting. That's always a great one. Talking about child abuse, there are some fabulous curricula out there specifically oriented around how to keep kids safe. So provide those continuing learning opportunities. Encourage the education of lay leaders. It does not have to be the person that everyone sees. A lot of times survivors are not going to go to the main pastor. They'll go to someone they feel comfortable with or they feel safe with. So encourage educating lay leaders and the wider community. Have support materials readily available. I am a big proponent of DVSA programs having brochures and giving them out to faith communities, because sometimes it might be in someone's drawer or in like a foyer. It might be somewhere that someone sees it. I have feelings about putting things in bathrooms or bathroom stalls. You can ask me about that later. But if you have something like on a mirror, when I was in the UK most recently, they have a kind of a growing movement where they have something kind of hanging in the bathroom that if someone feels unsafe, they can go up to like a wait staff person or a bartender and ask for something specific, and they know that that's like the keyword. So it's just in the bathroom. It's very just kind of quiet, but it's in there. Support the community on teaching about harm. Do those wider community educations. Teaching people about like healthy relationships is wonderful, because it is like, what are healthy peer relationships? What are healthy friendships? What are healthy relationships between kids and parents? What do those look like? One of the other wonderful things is producing a service map. So mapping out services in the community, and this can be social services, it can be ministries at faith communities, all of those types of things, because then folks know they don't have to do everything by themselves and that they're not alone in this work. And so then it connects people, and that builds that community, and that touches on that third point of coordination and collaboration. And educate young folks on healthy relationships. In some states, this is mandatory. And I think this is a wonderful way to reach out to faith communities, is really to talk about, we want to chat with people about what healthy relationships look like. Because we want people to be healthy. We want kids to be safe. So really, really orienting around that. Local action, this is going to be really building the capacity and the collective action of that individual community. And so if you remember that example I shared a little while ago about the rural town in Australia, and the people just didn't have the same definition of DV, what they realized is that to really like build and work together, they had to come together and like get real honest with each other, hence why they found out they had different definitions. But they had to like build off of what was already there. Taking a solution that worked in another town or in an urban area and plopping it down in a rural area might not work. It might, but it's not going to be organic, and it's not going to have the same type of ownership if you've had something that has been created and tailored to the community in and of itself. And so build off of what is already there and create new things in the gaps that you see. And if the local community is engaged in that process and they're identifying the gaps, they have so much more ownership over filling that gap and finding resources. Folks in rural areas are resourceful. And so if folks are kind of creating and dreaming of what makes sense for them there, it's going to have this like wonderful rooted element in that community. Another thing is, work with the faith-based social workers. There's whole national organizations of these folks. Connect with them, talk with them, find out what they're doing, what they're talking about. There are some faith communities that are not going to work with you as a social service provider. But if you come in as a Jewish social worker, they might be like, cool. That's awesome. So sometimes that reduces a barrier and helps with that action, and it can build bridges and build relationships. There's also is employee advocates from the community. And sometimes that's not possible, but sometimes it is. Like if you are a DV program and you've got satellite sites kind of throughout the area or in different counties, have someone local to that county that knows that area working in that area. And there can be kind of pieces of confidentiality around that and conflicts of interest and things like that. But the thing is that advocate knows that community so well and can speak to that and have that idea and those creative things and know how to build those relationships. They might even already have some of those existing relationships to build off of. And embed services in the community and the ministries that are already happening. That was kind of building off of this, what's already here. If there is already a ministry in a local church that is like providing like a food bank, can you provide some services? Can you do some like case management or some advocacy work while they're doing it? because that also provides a really great opportunity for someone to be gone for a couple of hours, and when they come back, they have food. Oh, I've been at the food bank. So it supports them in several different ways. So you're kind of providing multiple services. Aim for inclusion. Be broad in who you're including in these kind of discussions and who you're asking. There might be some louder voices in that community, but aim for inclusion. You know, the Spanish-speaking churches or the historically African-American churches, they might not always be invited to the table in some areas, but they will have such an amazing perspective on things that can be really, really wonderful. And this can include emerging leaders as well. So it can be the formal leaders. I like to call some of these gatekeepers. So a good example of this is my grandma. She's the one that lived in this little bitty town in East Texas. She literally taught everyone Sunday school in that town. She was 4'9", and she was a gatekeeper because everyone in town knew who she was. And she taught everyone Sunday school, so she knew everyone too. But she was not a formal pastor or minister, but everyone respected her and looked up to her and asked her questions and would go to her for advice. And so, yeah, I like how Shannon said, if they don't have a chair for you, bring your own. Oh, my grandma brought her own chair, and it was like a recliner. She brought her own chair. But it was so powerful because my grandmother's passed away. She passed away a number of years ago. But whenever my sister and I go back there, people know who we are through her. Oh, we're Laura Fuller's grandchildren. And they're like, oh, yeah, she taught us Sunday school. And it's a fascinating thing because people suddenly give us the kind of respect. They extend that relationship out to us as well, which is really fascinating. And so it's super, super cool. Inclusion can also be different denominations or different sects of a faith community. Be very thoughtful of that. When I was doing local services, there was a smaller rural community out in the west part of our county, probably just a couple thousand people. There were 15 churches, Christian churches alone. 10 of those were Baptists. But if any of y'all work with Baptists, you know Baptists are all sorts of different Baptists. But there was all those other folks there too. And so being really mindful that you are reaching and connecting with all the different groups that are out there. Find individual influencers. I think this is huge because there are so many stories where I have met folks and I have read about it where someone's all like, oh, I know someone. And you might experience this in your own advocacy. Someone calls you and they're like, hey, I have a friend that needs to talk to someone because you are connected to this world. You are that influencer. So they'll be all like, can you talk to so-and-so? This is also very true in rural areas. If you have someone that is like known to be someone who understands or knows things about domestic or sexual violence, people will be like, oh, hey, you know, Anna knows about them, Jessica knows about them, and you will become like an influencer. And that can be wonderful for faith leaders or folks in faith communities because then they can have a support system with other things, kind of bringing that service map back into play. That I know someone. And the coordination, I know the coordinated community response folks are going to love this. Invite people to CCRs. If you've got a CCR in that community, invite faith leaders. If you've got a task force, if you've got something less formal, invite folks to that. Invite faith leaders to the table. You can bring your chair too. Have more than one faith leader on the committee. One faith leader is not going to represent all the faiths and the different perspectives. You can have it kind of being an open door for them to come whenever they can, but making sure you're seeking folks out to be on that committee. A lot of communities, even small ones, will have ministerial alliances or town or regional alliances. Even small communities, this might not be that formal, but they might have like a pastor's brunch on Mondays. and like they all get together and talk. Because if you have been a faith leader, you need other faith leaders to understand what it's like to be a faith leader, because it's special. So they will know each other. So can you buy them breakfast? How can you build in, how can you work with them? How can you bring in that naturally kind of existing group that already exists? Coordinate those services, get a map, get a list going, coordinate resources. There are some groups that are really trying to streamline intake so people don't have to keep telling their story over and over and over. They can coordinate intake to different resources. Prioritize those local networks and relationships. So making sure that, you know, you're building off, someone can almost like vouch for you that, oh, I know so-and-so, or someone knows me. Collaboration increases creativity. I truly believe this, and this is sometimes a double-edged sword, because when we have more folks at a table, there's going to be more opinions, and that creates tension. But inside of that tension is a dynamic, like, kind of, you know, place where creative and really amazing options can come to light. And so it's in those kind of areas where we do have people that are disagreeing or coming with different experiences that can create those really creative options that can help us reach and support survivors. I think naming and faming is also really important. If someone's doing something great, share about it. That's a wonderful way to, because someone else might be like, oh, that's a cool idea, I want to try that. And then intersectional approach. When we're starting to really think of those intersecting issues, this allows the structures in our communities to have some solutions. So when we're kind of thinking through what's intersecting there, that creates some solutions that can be a little bit more concrete, that those structures can support, like a faith community. A faith community would be a structure. Law enforcement would be a structure, those types of structures. So how does this help us support survivors? A couple quick ways. It increases awareness of services. It increases access to services. It can support a seamless, consistent services to survivors. It can lower recidivism for perpetrators of harm. And it can prevent harm in general. So when we're engaging with faith communities and we have all these different options that we can, you know, include them and, you know, build off of what they're doing and, you know, get all those creative juices going, we create that awareness and we create more access to services. And it creates a place where perpetrators of harm can have accountability and can, you know, not harm anymore. There are some BIP curricula out there that one of the big foundational pieces is having someone in your wider community offer accountability for you. And a lot of men bring their faith leaders. And so how can we bring folks into that? And how can we prevent harm? So I think those are kind of some of the big areas for that. So I know we are running on time. So best practices, and again, best practices are going to be unique to engaging with faith communities in each community. But some of the kind of like 30,000-foot best tips, best practices, approach relationships with faith communities and faith leaders with intentionality and consistency. One thing that I've heard from faith leaders is like, social service people, it's just a revolving door. And they're like, I don't know who's there anymore. And that says a lot. And there is reality of that. Social services do have a high turnover rate. Some of it is because of what we're doing and what we're working on. It's hard to stay in the field and stewarding and holding trauma for folks. But relationships can also be with organizations, and you can have relationships with several people. And so that intentionality of, we want to know you, even if it's different advocates that you still know us, and you still know our work, and you still know what we're doing. And the consistency of it, just make sure someone's showing up, make sure someone's reaching out. Building relationships on trust, respect, mutual benefit, enjoyment, forgiveness, and common humanity. As I said earlier, faith communities can be this wonderful, beautiful place of healing. And so many folks approach faith communities as places of harm. And that, if you're approaching someone as like, you're bad, that's not going to go well. Some faith communities are harmful. A lot of them are not. Some of them are unintentionally harmful. But if you reach out with trust, if you trust them, and you might not 100% agree with them or their theology, and that's okay. But if you reach out with trust, and you reach out with respect and genuine curiosity, like if there's a faith community and you don't know anything about them, be curious, be genuinely and humbly curious about what you don't know. Tell them what they love about their faith, what they love about their faith community. Approach them with mutual benefit. Like a lot of nonprofits reach out to faith communities for donation, for financial support. And so a lot of faith communities expect that. So how can this be mutually beneficial for both organizations or both parties? And enjoy it. Like if you were all like, I hate this, then maybe a coworker or a colleague or someone like that can come with you or support you in that. And some faith communities are hard to be in for certain folks. And that's okay. If you have experienced religious abuse or you've experienced harm in a faith community and you're like, I'm not comfortable in this specific place, then that's okay. And I want you to take care of yourself. One of your colleagues might be all like, it's cool. I'm fine here. And so they might be able to step in there. Approaching with forgiveness as well. And that's a big topic, and I can talk more about that, for days. But really approaching with common humanity. We are humans. And one of the things that faith communities, they really do want to help people and they want to support people. And that's what social service folks do as well. And so you have that common humanity, you have that common goal. So being able to find that common ground is really important. And craft options for where faith communities are. Come alongside of them. Build off of what they have. Create the training or the education or the awareness for where they are. Some folks are never going to become like advocate extraordinaire, and that's okay. Meet them where they are and journey with them as long as you can. And as I said earlier, approach them with genuine curiosity and kindness. So I had a case study that I was going to provide for you all, but I think we're actually out of time. I can share that in the chat if you all would like to review that and like on your own and provide some questions for you. I'll drop that in the chat so you can look at it. But I gave y'all lots of examples. I'm sorry, I can talk to fill the space. So the case study's in there. And what I encourage you all do is on your own time after this or with your colleagues, spend a few minutes reading over it. It is a fictional account. It is not based on anyone that I know. And so I have not broken a confidentiality or anything like that. But think about from you and your role, whatever that might be, if you are in a social service, if you are a faith leader, if you are in law enforcement, if you're on a CCR, whatever role you might be in, how would you support the individual. So the case study is about a woman named Carolyn. And how would you support Carolyn? And then think through, okay, so, I'm providing immediate support. What would be the kind of structural pieces that I would want to do? What ideas do you recommend? What actions do you recommend to take that could potentially offer some structural support in that community? What opportunities are there? And then spend a little bit of time thinking, okay, so what stood out here? And why did it stand out? And so that kind of framework about, okay, supporting someone, what are the opportunities and what stood out? That's kind of a modality you can use in your work as well with engaging with faith communities. You can be like, okay, here's the situation. What ideas are standing out to me? What are the challenges? What are solutions? And then what's one thing I can take away? So I encourage you to do that on your own. The case study will be with this recording if you want to watch it over again, if you want to spend some time kind of unpacking it. I encourage you to. I love case studies, and I'm sorry I talked too long because I would have loved to hear some of your feedback for that. But at this time, I know we've got about 7 minutes left. I would love to open it up to see, do you all have comments? Do you have questions? Do you have things that you would just like to share from your experience? I know I went through some of that so fast. And so I would love to hear any thoughts or comments that you all have from the work that you all are doing.
It was very informative. We even have rural communities up here in Massachusetts. So it was very informative. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. I have this really wonderful opportunity to be able to work with coalitions, domestic and sexual violence coalitions all over the United States. And one of the things that I find so fascinating that in states that are smaller, there are still rural communities. Their rural is different. And I think that's such an important part is that your rural might not be that far away, but some of those barriers still might be there. Someone that lives in a close proximity to a big city might not want to drive in. So I kind of told y'all some of the examples of my aunts and uncles and my grandmother that live in this little town. They are an hour away from Houston proper, like Houston's giant medical center. They would rather drive 2.5 hours further into East Texas to get medical treatment than drive the 1 hour into Houston because they just don't like Houston. There's too much traffic. It feels unsafe. It is true. Houston traffic it's a little intense. But there's that thing where like in Massachusetts, someone might not want to go into Boston. So that's interesting. Would they potentially go to another state, a neighboring state, or a smaller town, but that's larger than the rural community in another state, if states are super close together? So I think that's a really interesting thing. So thanks for bringing that up, Sigrid. Judith put in the comments, oh, she's joining from the UK. Well, hello. So Judith said that she is a DV professional and about how CCR can be adapted to improve the safety of survivors of DV in rural communities. The CCR here is geared toward urban areas and really need to learn about places doing this better. So she would like to talk about that. Judith, I will reach out to you because like my spouse is British, one. Two, I used to live in the UK. I lived there for a number of years. So I got all sorts of things to talk to you about, Judith. I'll copy your email address in there. We can have a great old chat. Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say thank you. I was writing that and I just thought, oh dear, that's a bit long. So apologies for breaking into all the comments, but yeah, just really keen to learn from the work you're doing in the States because you're way ahead of us.
I wouldn't always say like way ahead. I think there's like different things, like because I don't know if you were here at the very beginning. I started working in this movement for a rape crisis center in Oxfordshire. So like I got a very different education and than I've ever gotten here in the US. So anyways, I'll have to talk about that later, Judith. We'll connect. But
Yeah,
yeah.
mhm. I would like to say thank you also. Very informative. This is Anita. One thing that I was listening to, because there's so much stuff that about getting my church more involved, because you can talk about it, but you still need to be educated. And I think it's like 20 churches within the 5 miles of where I'm at. So if I can get this to our church, that can help us, because you still need to be educated in order to have people come in, because you still need to have safety protocols also.
Thank you so much, Anita.
Yes.
Renee shared in the chat, I'm from a rural community and found everything helpful. Thank you so much. One population to include is the LGBTQ plus. And yes, I did not focus on that community, and I apologize. That is a huge area and most definitely an underserved community. And there's a lot of nuances with that in a rural area because again, like everyone knows you or everyone thinks they know you. Getting support, outing people, the potential of harm and threats to harm. I've known folks in rural areas that were basically excommunicated from their family when they came out. And so it's very real and very, very like dire, and the barriers for LGBTQ survivors in rural areas are even higher. So thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate that. Okay, so we have a couple people echoing that. We are in our last minute. I will share my PowerPoint where you'll be able to find the recording of this. If you would like it yourself, you can most definitely email me. I do like a good peer review journal, and so I did read some really wonderful ones. And then if you would like to contact me, this is my email here. And you can always check out my website or Facebook or LinkedIn and always connect with me that way. I would love to connect with you all and hear more about what you're doing in your areas. I saw folks from all over the nation, so I'd love to know what folks are doing in your area. From East Texas, we would say your neck of the woods. You might not have woods where you are, but in East Texas, there are woods. So in your neck of the woods. Please reach out. I would love to have a conversation. If you've got questions, if I've said anything that you're like, can you like explain that more? Can you go into more detail? Let me know. I'm here to support you all and help you all. Thank you so much for joining. I wanted to thank Becky and Lacey, who couldn't be here, from ICCR, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. I most definitely have loved this and being able to join you all. And so have a wonderful afternoon. I will probably see some of you all in other capacities and other places in the near future. And I hope to be able to see some of you all at another webinar sometime soon. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you, Suzanne. We so appreciate you sharing your time and wow, astounding expertise. We hear stuff about rural. That's what we are with ICCR all the time. And the points that you brought up were still really, really enlightening, and really just appreciate your insight and expertise and your perspective from your neck of the woods in East Texas. So that's amazing. Again, y'all are from every walk of life, and we appreciate all of that perspective. If you do hear from friends that were trying to log in, unfortunately, because we held this as a meeting and not as a webinar, unbeknownst to us, we were locked at 100 people, but it is recorded, so we will make it available to everyone that registered. And as Suzanne said, she is sharing the PowerPoint and all of that. As hopefully y'all know, we're only a short few months away from our favorite time of year, the Conference on Crimes Against Women, which we hold every May in Dallas. Registration is open. So if you want more excellent rule perspective, along with everything else having to do with human trafficking, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, you name it, rural communities, urban communities, military, tribal, campus, we got you covered. Let's see here. And at the end of today's webinar, a survey will populate in your browser. Please take a few moments to complete it in order to receive your certificate. The survey link will also be sent as a follow-up in your email. A recording of today's presentation will be available on the ICCR website by the end of the week. And again, if you have any questions, reach out to any of us. We're so happy to help and hope you'll have an amazing week. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. And you even got a quick peek of my cat who jumped up here.